Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and then turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any conversations. Now, I'm excited to share with all of you a conversation that I got to have with Danny Baumann. Danny and his wife have been coming to the Ridge for about 5 years. They serve in Ridge Kids, and they're both really amazing people. And one of the things that I really love about them is just how much they actually live out their faith in Jesus. Danny works in sales, and I got a chance to ask him about how his faith impacts his work and how he builds connections with his coworkers, and then how he tries to represent Jesus in the workplace. There's some really solid practical advice in here, no matter where you work, and I hope this conversation is one that you'll enjoy just as much as I did. This is my conversation with Danny. Hey, Danny, thanks for coming on the Ridge podcast.
Of course, happy to be here.
Yeah, so maybe you could start us off. Would you mind sharing just a little bit about yourself and what you do for work?
Yeah, so my name's Danny Baumann. I'm 27 years old, been coming to the Ridge for about 5 years. I'm married, got a golden retriever dog. Currently, we have 2 foster kids staying with us as well. So the house is getting a lot more hectic. As far as work goes, I'm in tech sales. Right now, I'm selling a marketing, planning, and budgeting software to enterprise marketing companies. And I work remotely, so you're in my office right now.
Okay, so I have to follow up on the busy house thing. So now you've hit fall, everyone's indoors, kind of, right? Is that like created extra chaos?
Still trying to push them outside as much as we can. I mean, I know, John, you probably don't know this because you're not in Wisconsin, but it was 85 degrees today and yesterday. So it was like a little glimpse of summer still here. So we're still
jealous. It was pouring down rain in Seattle yesterday. So I'm jealous, but I'm going to be over. I'm going to be back shortly. So I'm coming back in like 2 weeks. So hopefully the nice weather will hold out.
Yeah. You might get some classic Wisconsin fall at that point, but that's good too. We love fall here. We got an October birthday in the house. So lots to look forward to.
Nice. Awesome. Well, hey, why don't we dive into kind of the meat of our conversation, talking about work and faith and how those things kind of work together. And I know maybe that's for some people, they're hearing that and they kind of put those two things into compartments and feel like, oh, those two things don't interact with each other, almost like the faith and politics and the workplace and all those things kind of people have, I feel like, a lot of different takes and thoughts on those things. And I'm curious, just how do you feel like your faith impacts your work?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you started that question with that preamble there, and that was me. Like, for some reason, I've been following Jesus for quite a few years now, but for some reason at work, like, I always just felt like what happens between 9 to 5, like, that's on me. When I'm praying at night, I'll pray for my health, I'll pray for my family, I'll pray for a whole bunch of things, but I don't know if I just felt like selfish or what to be praying about work. And so I wouldn't. And it kind of led to this thing where, if 9 to 5 is on me and 9 to 5 isn't going well, where does that leave you? You got to work harder, you got to work longer, and just kind of an unhealthy relationship. And when it's going good, then you're also kind of, again, lying to yourself where, hey, I'm the best, I'm leading the team, I got all the answers. And then, in sales, you're constantly on that treadmill, chasing that number, competing, very high pressure, especially in today's environment, like not a lot of job security. So, the second your name starts to kind of drop down that list, you're like, oh, am I going to get let go? They just let someone else go. And I got anxiety. And so it just became kind of a mess really quickly. And so my work is actually going to help me bring my faith in, because it became very apparent that was not sustainable. Actually, the leader of my Ridge group, she's a realtor, and she started praying about work. And I was like, why am I not doing this? Nothing wrong with praying that God will put people in your lives that needs what you're selling, and maybe that God will make it apparent when there's someone in your work life that doesn't need what you're selling. You can kind of get out of that. So that was kind of a big shift for me, is just starting to pray about work in general, because that was, like you said, it was totally a different box for me for a long time, too long.
So is that like, and I am praying throughout the day? Is that like, oh, I just want to make sure that when I like have my normal rhythms of when I pray, I include work in that? Is that like taking a second when it's super stressful? Like when you say pray about work, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. Kind of what the first iteration was is when, work wasn't going very well. And so I just like literally wrote out the list of, hey, this is something I can control, and this is something that I can't. And if it's on the I can't control list, that's something I should probably be praying about. And so when I'm making that list, I'll pray over it. And then that's also at the top of my mind. Later on when I am praying, when I wake up in the morning or before bed, hey, here are the things I can't control. Like, God, these are on you. Um, do with these what you'd like. I'm willing to follow you on however this looks at work. So it started with just that list, like very basic. It took me a while to figure that one out, and then it just kind of grows. Once you start inviting him into something, you feel more comfortable turning to him with everything, big things, smaller things, work things, non-work things. So that was kind of the first iteration of, let's just build a list and start praying about the stuff that only he can handle.
Was that like a nerve wracking thing? Like when you're praying, it's kind of like that concept of like you're praying and, hey, God, do something cool here. And then you also have to be aware of that he might do something.
Yeah. I mean, um, I guess in my life, there's a story there, because I left a job that I was doing really well at, where I was, getting kind of cocky, and I left for what I thought was a better job. And I ended up getting fired from that better job like within 6 months. And it was just pretty much the whole time was just terrible. Like, it was
Yeah.
very clear I made a big mistake. And so when I'm praying, I'm asking God, like, anybody with a need, can I please talk to them?
Hmm.
Please give me patience. Can you help me navigate this tricky situation, kind of the politics and some of the toxicity here? Like, how can I handle this? How can I reflect you in this? And ultimately, God's answer was apparently, I'll just get you out of there. But the
Yeah.
problem with the way he chose to do it was, I usually like to kind of leave things on my terms, and on this one, it was like, they asked me to leave. They told me to leave. So there was a pride thing there too, where I've always prided myself on being a top performer, and all of a sudden I'm being let go, and I was the first person let go on my team.
Hmm.
Uh, and I knew the company wasn't doing well, and I knew there was probably going to be more, but I was the first.
Hmm.
So that was kind of a reflection of like, so what's going on? Was I really putting everything I had into this job? Was I putting too much into this job? Where it ended up becoming kind of an idol, where I was worshiping success at this, really what I thought perfect opportunity company,
Hmm.
stepping stone for me. Um, and I had to come to grips with both sides of that, because the truth was probably both. Like, yeah, I was idolizing success at this job too much,
Yeah.
uh, and putting too much effort maybe in the wrong places. And also, I was probably a little bit over my head. I probably oversold myself for this position, and they realized that before I did. And it took me
Mhm.
getting fired to realize, like, you know what? Everybody wants that next thing, but if you're not ready for it, like, it's probably gonna be best for you to move on. So,
Yeah.
um, obviously, then when you get let go, you have a lot more time, and you have a lot more questions for God, and
Yeah.
time to dig into kind of all the emotions that could start up when that happens.
You brought up, I think, two interesting things that you were kind of like praying for throughout that process. And I actually want to touch on both of them, because there's like you mentioned like the toxicity and the like, I guess prayers for the relationships for your coworkers. And I'll
Hmm.
touch on that in a second. But first, you mentioned the idea of just like praying specifically for it sounds like your clients, right? Like so that you would interact with people and you'd be able to like find a need, right?
Yeah.
And so That's an interesting, like, that is almost a prayer of like for the people you're trying to serve. That's like a whole different like mentality thought process. Uh, can you like maybe share some on that?
Yeah, and I think that's just what it is. Like it's a total mentality shift, and at the root of it is really like a control thing again, where it's like, you know, like God, you're using me in this role right now. Like how do you want to use me? Will you put someone in front of me that needs what I have so that
Mm,
I can help them with what they need help with?
mm,
Because when you're in sales and you you know you see that number and you see that leaderboard every day, like you just want to sell. You just want sell anything to anyone.
yeah.
But if that's your mentality, like, people sniff that out too. So like
Mm,
very practically, like you can tell when a sales rep has commission breath and are just trying to get something, to go versus when someone really has that servant mentality of that, like, can I actually help you? Or maybe I have a recommendation for you that's not in the best interest of my company, but I think it'll actually help you and it'll help build trust and maybe you'll come back later. But I only really want the people that actually have a need for what I'm selling. Um, and then I pray that when I get that opportunity, I can communicate that clearly and show the value that I do have to offer because I do believe that my product will help in a couple of these specific situations. God, just help me find these people, help me get through
yeah.
them, help me build a business case with them. Every single step, um, you're really just trying to shepherd someone through a process that ultimately is going to really benefit them. Otherwise, they're not going to spend money. So,
I think that's also a cool example of how these faith principles of following Jesus kind of work their way into what you're doing, right? Because there's this counterintuitive principle, right, of like to lead you serve, right? Like that's very congruent with following Jesus. But I'm sure in the sales world, right? Like you just mentioned it, like there's that bottom dollar, there's that leaderboard, which is like almost that constant shift of focus away from that concept to self.
mhm.
Um, and so it's cool to see that those principles, like that seem counterintuitive, are actually very helpful and like let you become a better salesperson.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I mentioned in some of my interviews when I was trying to get the job I currently have, where um, if you're a Christian, I think you tend to have a little bit more awareness and humility of where your downfalls are, where your shortcomings are. And the problem is when you do really well in sales, you get blinded to that. And I think that's true in life in general. Like when you're on the mountaintop, like you just think, I'm unstoppable. I can do whatever I want. I don't need God. And so I definitely fell into that. And it took me getting fired to really kind of get back to like, okay, God, like, what do you want me to be doing? First of all, how do you want me to be doing it? How can I be successful here? And so there's a lot of layers there that kind of have to work through. And it took me way too long to kind of realize, to your point, like some of the stuff that as a Jesus follower um, should be the basics of putting people first. And not to say I didn't, but it was just my motivation was way more selfish than servant.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that the other cool thing about that story is just that you use that opportunity as a moment to ask God and say, "Hey, this I kind of took a right hook, you took the punch,
Yep.
and instead of being like, "Hey God, what are you doing?" You're like, "Hey God, what are you showing me?" And I
Right.
think that mentality, I feel like, is what's like kind of like let you learn and grow, which I think is a cool testament to the perspective and the character too. Uh, you mentioned kind of praying for those inner office connections and kind of avoiding the toxicity. Like, what does it look like to bring those faith elements into kind of your coworker friendships?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this to you when you asked me to do this. I don't think I do this perfectly all the time, but I think it is something that I've tried to be intentional about my approach at least.
Hmm.
And it's a big change I had to make. I'm been an introvert for most of my life, and I still definitely am at my core. But being in sales, you got to love people, you got to love talking to them, and I've been developing that. But I haven't, in my previous roles, done a good enough job, I think, forging those internal relationships as well as I needed to. And if I was, it was mostly like selfish motives, right? Like I'm going to make really good friends with my boss. because he controls if I'm going to stay here, how much I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
right. I'm going to make really good friends with these key teammates that, if they like me, they'll help me more on these deals. Um, Rather than treating people like people, which is
Right.
ultimately
Yeah.
as a salesperson, like what we should be doing. And as a Jesus follower, what we should be doing um, even more than people, like children of God, people,
Mm.
so I think getting a fresh start at this new company is about a year ago has given me a great opportunity. And I made sure I went out of my way to try to connect with people individually, and starting over is a great time to do that because people expect you to be reaching out and introducing yourself when you're new. And it's
Mm.
not weird to ask those questions that are like maybe personal and not super related. And people are going to carve out the time because it's the new guy and we got to show how welcoming our environment is and all that. So it's, it was a really cool opportunity. And I had that time to reflect in terms of things I did poorly at the last company, which was really like just kind of head down, do everything I need to do, make a friends with a few people, but not go wide. And at this new company, trying to just form those connections. And it's a win-win, right? You get tips from people like, hey, what's made you successful? What have you seen help you in this role? But also just get to know them on a personal level,
Mm.
um, which can be hard when you work remote. I mean, I know you're obviously remotely tuned into the Ridge, and you're not a part of those water cooler conversations. You don't hear people
Yeah.
talking about things, so you actually really do have to be intentional about getting in front of people, um, putting time on the calendar. Just say, hey, if you have 15 minutes, love to catch up and hear about your weekend.
Mm.
Um, and I thought that's a little bit of the cons of the remote world, but some of the pros, I mean, this may sound kind of creepy, but I have like a folder in my notebook digitally, and I just have names of all my coworkers. And so whenever
Mm.
I talk to someone or I talk to someone new, I'll start a new folder, like, okay, here's the John note. And I'll just take notes on what we talked about, even if it has like no relevance or takeaway for work, but like, hey, Cindy got married, her husband's name's, Tim, and this is what they're going through. And now I have stuff that I can follow up with them, like, hey, how did that go? I also have stuff I can pray for them about. So there's multiple angles there, and I think that's kind of a nice thing, especially if you're not super comfortable talking to people or you struggle to remember things like that. Which, sometimes names are tough too, and guess what? On Zoom, your name's right there. So I've got a lot of
Yeah.
it kind of greases the skids for some of this stuff, and you just have to kind of be intentional about nurturing that, I'd say.
No, I mean, I think that's like a very practical thing. Like, I don't think it's creepy. I think there's probably a way you can make it creepy, but, I think that's like a tool. Ultimately, what's the heart behind it? And their heart is, man, I want to connect with them better. I want to be able to, like you mentioned, pray for them, you know? Um, and so, I mean, you're listening right now and you're like, man, I can't even remember my coworkers' names. I don't know if they have kids or not, maybe jot down a quick note, and say, hey, this is gonna be my little reminder, and I know where this is at. And um, I think the goal behind it is probably key in terms like, hey, why are you doing this? And it's like, well, I'm doing this because I want to be able to connect with them better. And I think that's like just super practical.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing I found too is because I've worked both. My first sales job was in person, and all of us had cubicles in the same big room, so you can hear everything that's going on in the room, and there's
Mm.
pros and cons to that. But now that I work alone all day in my home office, I'm on a one-on-one conversation with somebody. I'm also much more likely to bring up things that I probably wouldn't if 40 other people were going to hear them.
Sure.
And so for me, I usually, historically would keep things kind of close to the chest in terms of like talking about my personal life, just weather
Yeah.
and sports, right? But you don't really get anywhere in relationships if it's weather and sports. So
Mm.
it's been cool. Like at my new company, we're on a one-on-one, and my boss asks me how my weekend goes. I'm much more likely to share, like, what, kind of a tough weekend, like
Mm.
going through this with the kids, or my wife and I are struggling with this stuff that we might not. I probably wouldn't have brought up a lot of this stuff if I knew the rest of the office was going to hear about it. And once you
Mm.
share something personal, and sometimes you do have to be the first person to share something personal. I'm not saying like be weird about like first time you meet someone, hey, here's my life problems. But
Yeah.
when you have that relationship, you can start to get there, and you might have to be the first person to offer it up. But then I found, at least in my new company, like everybody's just been like so awesome and loving in response to some of the stuff we've been going through. And now you're on like a whole another level. Like
Mm.
I'll just share, like, so my wife and I have been trying to start a family for a while, and that's tough. It's really tough. And so I shared that with my coworkers, and now they kind of all know about it. And, we have quarterly goals. We go through every quarter as a team, and I'll put like start a family on there. And another one of the guys was struggling with it too. And now we're talking on the
Mm.
side about a very serious issue. He's not Christian. I am, obviously. And so we get a chance to kind of compare and contrast. And, he's saying things like, man, I hope your faith is helping you through this. And now we're talking about things that I never, like, that was not my intention. This wasn't like my master plan to share about myself and end up getting a chance to talk about faith. But people are curious and people care about you, and you have to give them that opportunity to get to that level. I think. And so that's been really cool. And I feel way more connected to my coworkers now. I have like genuine friendships, I'd say, even though I've only seen them in person one time. So that's for me another big pro of the remote world, is just being able to have that kind of confidentiality when you're sharing with people, and you
Yeah.
can have deeper conversations.
You brought up like the start to having some faith conversations. I'm curious, what is the culture around faith in your office? Or I realize that remote work might make that more interesting, but also I think at the same time there's probably still a dynamic amongst the company. So
Yeah, I mean, my last three jobs have been at, like San Francisco based tech companies, very secular. Like there's not
yeah,
a culture of, we have holiday break. We don't have Christmas break. It's that kind of
yeah,
thing, right? So it's not like there's a culture of talking about faith or anything like that. It is interesting. People are not afraid to talk about like spirituality. I had another guy I
hmm,
reached out to one on one about 2 weeks ago. I heard he was into Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and I've been wanting to
interesting.
try that out. So I was just asking him, like, hey, thinking about doing this. And we've never really talked before. He's on a different team, but I just heard like, oh, he's into that. So shoot him a note, and he's like, dude, it'd be the best decision for you, like mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And so like he's not afraid to mention like spiritual health. Like
Hmm,
if he's gonna crack that door open, I'm kind of curious what he's getting at. Like how
yeah.
does a martial art help you spiritually? What does he think of spirituality?
Hmm,
Uh, so it's people aren't afraid to talk about spirituality as much as maybe like Christianity or the church, so to speak.
hmm, yeah.
Um, but on one-on-one conversations, when that door gets cracked open, I think that's something that we can lean into.
Yeah. How do you feel like that affects like I don't know, somebody asks you about your weekend, you're like, "Oh yeah, I was at my church and such and such happened." Like, is there a hesitancy to say that? Do you feel like the door's open enough to like share with that? Do you feel like you've earned the right to say those things? Curious your thoughts on that.
Um, at my previous job, I would say, I would mention like, yeah, I went to church this weekend, or we served at church to my boss on like a one-on-one. At this new company now, because we like literally give a presentation every quarterly like business plans, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the slides is goals. I'll have goals like related to church in there.
Hmm.
So like that I kind of wanted to be more intentional when I came to this new company too, of like, I'm just gonna there's a lot made about HR circles, like bring your whole self to work. I'm just gonna try to do that a little bit more, where I'm just
Yeah.
nothing to be ashamed of here, and they don't have to agree with me. I'm never gonna push it on people.
Mm-hmm.
I think Craig Rochelle says this: I'll never push my faith, but I'll never hide it either. And that's been kind of my mentality. Like if I have a genuine goal, if I have a genuine thing that happened to me, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk
Mm-hmm.
about how I want to grow in my leadership at serving in Ridge Kids, or started speaking on stage hosting. Like that was I was very nervous about that. This is something I want to get better at. And I'll tell my team that. We got signed up with Safe Families like 6 months ago. So I
Mm-hmm.
drew that on my goals. Like I want to host my first Safe Families kids. Oh, what's that? Now we're having a conversation about that. Obviously, we
Mm-hmm.
became foster care certified after that. And so they were very in tune. Like for one quarter, it was finish all my foster care trainings was my personal goal. One of my personal goals. And the next goal was get our first foster care placement. That happened. The next goal is become a better foster dad. And I'm going to do that by reading this book and trying to implement that. And they're not afraid to ask follow-up questions to like push you on like, how are you going to accomplish that? So, um, it's been really cool. And when we did get the foster kids, because I brought them into the whole process, um, It's really cool. I went outside to go get the kids from school, and there was like Amazon packages up to my neck on our front door. I'm like, what did Kayla buy? Like, what is this stuff? Opening it up, it's all like kids' toys, and
Wow.
there was thank you. There was like the gift notes in there, and it was from all my coworkers from teams I've never interacted with. And it
Yeah.
was like, holy cow! Like I could start crying right now. Like this is the coolest
Yeah.
thing. Like they just spent a ton of money to send toys because they knew I got foster kids and I don't have kids right now, so I probably don't have all these toys. And now we've got slip and slides and squirt guns and Legos and all this cool stuff. And so it was really cool. And I just think like, man, if I would have just like hid this or maybe just told it to my boss, I would have got all these toys. No, it's just like we wouldn't have this connection. They wouldn't be cheering for me
Yeah.
in every area of my life. But right now, it's just like I feel so much happier at work too because I know like this is a supportive group of people.
Hmm.
And guess what? Getting foster kids is probably going to make me a slightly worse employee because I'm not going to be able to work as long and distracted and have
Yeah.
appointments to get them to. But they're still like all in, and that's really cool.
Hmm. You you kind of talked about like the separation between, not hiding your faith but not pushing it.
Hmm.
Uh, where like how do you toe that line? How do you not go into one side and if that question makes sense?
Yeah, I think I guess from my perspective, I will talk about my faith's role in maybe what I'm going through.
Hmm.
Uh, but unless they ask a question, I'm not going to ask them like too much. Like I
Hmm.
might ask, like I think maybe the furthest I've asked is like, so did you grow up going to church, or what does that look like?
Yeah.
Uh, and that's just kind of how I've been handling it. They know about kind of where I stand with everything, and if they want to come ask me questions, if they're going through hard things, um, I'd be more than happy to talk to them about it. Like I said, we had that conversation about fertility with one of my coworkers, which is a cool opportunity. So that's kind of my take on it. I'd be curious to see kind of what you think, how that line should be towed. But for me, it's like, we're kind of talking about it right now. Our last message was about church hurt. And so it's
Hmm.
like, you don't want to be that stereotypical like view of Christians where you're just like won't stop bugging people about it.
Yeah.
But I think for me, something that's been impactful to Kayla and I, there was a Francis Chan book. I think it's called Crazy Love, and he had a little YouTube snippet after that, and he kind of says in that book like you should be living life in a way that doesn't make sense for unbelievers.
Hmm.
Um, live life in a way that like demands explanation almost, and
Hmm.
that was really challenging to me because, and it's kind of wraps in with work. Like when I got my job out of college, like my whole goal was like, how much money can I make? How early can I retire and stop working?
Hmm.
And this book and becoming deeper and growing in my faith is kind of pushing me into more of like, I think God wants me to work my whole life. He has a lot of uses for me.
Hmm.
And yeah, I still want to be a good steward of his resources. Um, but I also need to be living life in a way that um, is maybe uncomfortable. Maybe it's not just like the whole middle class lifestyle with, hey, we go to church on Sunday. Maybe it's doing something crazy like having foster kids in our house before we have kids of our own, before we even know how to parent.
Yeah.
That was great. Like that, I'm very uncomfortable. Like I was extremely, I was like so nervous. It's like
Yeah.
this is a little crazy. I didn't want to like. Kayla was like, "This is a great idea." And I was like, "Kayla, we're jumping straight into the deep end." And you know what? Like, I think sometimes God wants you to jump in the deep end. I think He wants you to get uncomfortable, and so that's what we're trying to do. And I think when it comes to talking about faith in your workplace, like I don't have to say a lot about my faith if I'm showing it in what I'm doing, and
Hmm.
I'm making it clear like what I'm doing. I think it's pretty obvious to most of my coworkers that, having two foster kids in our house before we became parents, like nobody else is doing that. Nobody else would think to do that. And I wouldn't have either if I didn't think that's what Jesus was asking me to do.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm doing it. And so I
Hmm.
think that I'm hoping that that speaks enough to my values and what I think about Jesus's call in my life, then I'm actually going to do it. Um, so I think that can go a long way, where I don't have to say like, do you know about Jesus? Do you know Jesus?
Yeah.
Happy to have those conversations, but I want them to come up like organically because of my like reputation in the workplace of being a hard worker, being someone that's willing to serve his teammates and willing to serve other people when he's not at work too.
Mm.
That I think is more important. Like when I leave this job, like in the tech industry, like people cycle like every year or two. It's like these people might not be a part of my life in 6 months. I could get let go. It's all very tumultuous. And so they're not going to remember like the deal I brought in, but they'll probably remember that they sent me Legos because this crazy kid got 2 foster kids. And I don't know why like he did that. And I'm prepping my QBR for next week. I'm going to have some updates on that. I'm going to have some losses to share, and some things that if they were Christian, they'll be praying for me for. And if they're parents and going through similar stuff, like that's another opportunity for us to connect.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's really powerful stuff. That's really good stuff. Cause I think that you've earned trust through connection and conversation and actually valuing people, and built those connections for the sake of a connection, for the sake of a friendship, of a relationship, of knowing them. And then you've not hidden what you value, and then you've lived out those values, and so you talk about not being pushy, right? And pushy, I feel like in a lot of ways is making people feel as though if they don't follow your values, if they don't act the same way, then you value them less. I feel like that's a huge concept of that. And it sounds like you've earned the right to live out your values, and you are doing that. And then that's, at least in some capacity, sparking conversations. And when those happen, or when they see that example, they're asking that question, like you mentioned the guy talking to you about, man, I hope your faith is helping you get through that, and then when you see yourself get through that, hey, maybe he did it better than I did. Right. And then I think that goes back to that valuing the people as people, not as a project to like check off the list and accomplish. You've mentioned like a few different, like you mentioned like a quote from Grishel, you mentioned Francis Chan. It sounds like you've been purposeful about like growing and learning. Like how do you go about that?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. In college, I was a part of Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and there was a few leaders there that spent a lot of time with me and also plugged me into some really good like Christian thinkers and authors.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big podcast guy. I listen to you too. But Craig Rochelle's got a great podcast. I love a lot of Francis Chan and just the boldness of how he challenges people to get uncomfortable. I think we need more of that in the church. And I also, the FCA leader, when we graduated, gave us all a book, Every Good Endeavor by Timothy Keller. I like a lot of Keller's work too. Yeah. And it was, I didn't get through it all actually when he gave it to me. Keller writes some thick books sometimes, but I only got through a few chapters and I circled back to it. And that's where a lot of this stuff in terms of like, when I said, like, I used to just think of work as like, how soon can I retire and how much can I make and when will I get promoted? And that book really helped me kind of realize that I was thinking about work differently than God was thinking about work. God worked too. Jesus worked too. They didn't do it because they had to. They did it because there's just inherent value in work. No matter what you're doing, there's what's the right word for this? There's value in it, right? There's dignity in work. He doesn't want you to stop working. He entrusted us to do his work for him right now and to take care of his creation, which is everything. And his most valued creation is people. And so that kind of is where that perspective comes in, where, we are stewards of everything that God's given us. The money we earn from work, yes, but also our time and also how we're treating people. And so that's just a great book. I would go read that, Every Good Endeavor by Timothy Keller. If the concept of Jesus in work and God's role in work and how he views it. Also ideas behind like overwork and underwork. You don't want to make work an idol, but you don't want to be lazy. God called us to work hard and to use all of our talents, and he gave us all this time, energy, and talent. We need to be like cultivating that and using that. You don't want to be a lazy coworker, a lazy Christian coworker. Like that doesn't give God a good picture either. Like that's not a good testament to who he was. If you've watched The Chosen, like I think The Chosen does a really good job depicting Jesus, like working his tail off every single day, getting exhausted, but still praying before bed. It's like, that's what a good day looks like. You serve people from the moment you stop praying to the moment you started praying before bed, and yeah, he also has a Sabbath. So like, don't, like there's the ebb and flow, right? Like there's always like a trade-off in a lot of this stuff, but God laid the blueprint for us, and it's good to get back to that, right? And kind of make sure you're aligned. And I don't do it perfectly, so this is a good podcast reminder, like this, revisit that book and rethink through a lot of this stuff and how I can be doing it better too.
Oh, it's really good. I just added that to because I love Keller, but I haven't read that one, so I just added that to my reading list. That's good.
Yeah, it's not like a top seller. It's one that they gave out to everybody that was part of FCA that graduated. But when you search Keller, it doesn't pop up right away. But it's a good one. I think he's got a lot of good thoughts on a lot of that stuff.
Danny, thank you so much for sharing some of your story and your experiences and what you've learned, and some fun lessons, some less fun lessons, and everything in between. So, but thanks for sharing with us, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, John. It was fun.
Well, that was my conversation with Danny. 2 quick takeaways. One is to pray for all parts of your work, not just your own performance, but also for your coworkers and for your clients. You never know what God is going to do in your heart, what in their lives, and in your work as well. The second thing, and I love how Danny described this, but the impact of how living your life differently really creates different conversations with those that you work with. That is such a powerful reminder of such a powerful thing you can do just by your actions and people knowing that you follow Jesus. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast. Make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.